The glow of Billy's laptop cast long shadows across his brother Rick's face as they sat side by side on the bed, both transfixed by the dizzying digital labyrinth unfolding before their eyes. It had all started with an offhand comment one of Rick's friends made at school about accessing the dark web, claiming it held untold secrets if one knew where to look. Of course, Billy had cautioned against it, reciting all the horror stories he'd read about the illegal commerce that thrived in the darknet's anonymity. But Rick was ever the thrill seeker, goading Billy into helping him learn the truth. And so they found themselves here, peering into the secret corners of the internet that lurked past the safe zones of Google and Facebook. Billy kept one eye on Rick, worried for what foolish ideas might take hold in his brother's reckless mind. "What you hoping to see exactly?" he asked cautiously as Rick clicked from one strange URL to the next. Rick shrugged, feigning nonchalance, though his quickening breaths betrayed his excitement. "Just nosy, I guess. I mean, if it's all just stories like you said, then we have nothing to worry about, right?" Billy frowned, unconvinced. The claims of red rooms, assassinations for hire, and human trafficking had seemed far-fetched when discussed in hushed tones at school. But staring at listings for hard drugs, stolen data, and firearms available with a few keystrokes made it chillingly plausible. A Tor browser was all that separated this criminal free. For all from regular social media, no different than scrolling Instagram or Snapchat. But was there truly no way to trace their IP or identify them? No authority regulating these dark dealings? As if reading his mind, Rick smiled slyly. "Scared?" he challenged. Billy bristled at that. He was always the more sensible one, looking out for his impulsive sibling. "No, I'm being smart," he shot back. "This stuff is no joke, Rick." One wrong click. His voice trailed off, not wanting to finish the thought. But they both knew the unspoken danger lurking behind each anonymous profile. If anyone found out their real names and location. Try as he might, Billy's worry gave way to cautious curiosity the deeper they ventured. One listing caught his eye, advertising fake IDs as good as the real thing. A thrill of adrenaline shot through him at the thought of possessing a sham passport or driver's license. He had always been too straight, lacing, glancing at Rick. He could tell the idea captivated his brother just as much. Over his better judgment, Billy heard himself say, "We should try something small, just to test if it's really anonymous, like they claim." A grin split Rick's face, green eyes alight with new mischief. Billy realized his mistake too late. He had given the thrill seeker just enough rope. A fake ID sounds perfect. Rick agreed with barely contained glee. "No harm in that, right? We'll order one to see if it arrives, and boom, no way to trace us." Billy sighed resignedly, knowing resistance was futile once Rick set his mind to something. Against all logic and safety, the dare was sealed. They were plunging headlong into the lurking darkness of the deep web, the fallout of which they could only guess. For the next hour, they scoured listings, weighing options through the lens of OPSEC. A low-profile purchase reduced risks of exposure versus bigger payoffs, they figured. Finally settling on a seller with good reviews, they placed an anonymous order via Bitcoin, the last untraceable strand separating their foolish actions from accountability. The exhilaration of the feat eclipsed rational thought. But later, as Billy drifted off to sleep, his mind replayed the murky crimescape they had toyed with that night, sowing seeds of unease. The dark web was very real and very unpredictable in its reach. Where would its tendrils extend from this small first taste of rebellion? Weeks passed without incident, and the thrill faded like an adrenaline high, memory blunted by new distractions of high school routine. Billy tried not to dwell on their indiscretion, knowing lingering fear bred more fear. Slowly, the dark web escapade became another half-forgotten story, shared between the brothers, left to gather dust in that dimly recalled corner of the internet. Then one innocuous Tuesday evening, a knock pulled them from homework, finding a package on the threshold bearing no return details, addressed only to Rick's Bitcoin, Elias. The blood drained from Billy's face. This was no practical joke. Their brief foray into the netherworld had truly manifested physical form on their doorstep. Panic seized both boys as they tore into the parcel, finding only a high-quality fake driver's license, framed in Rick's own photograph. With rising dread, Billy realized the anonymous underworld held more power and reality than they had ever imagined, even when safely back in the lit world. Their harmless game had elicited a very real and potentially dangerous response. In delving into the darkness, had they brought it back with them? The fake ID lay between them like a widening fissure, its laminated surface gleaming under the bedroom lamp. All color had drained from Rick's face, leaving only a waxy pallor, eyes locked on the damning proof of their foolishness. Billy paced circuits around the room, running shaking hands through his hair. "What do we do? What do we do?" He muttered under his breath, thinking fast. They had to destroy it, erase any trace of this ever happening before things spiraled further out of control. Grabbing the ID, Billy shoved it under his desk lamp lens to warp and peel away the laminate. "Hurry, hurry," Rick urged, glancing uneasily at the closed bedroom door. But the flimsy plastic proved more resilient than expected. As Billy scratched desperately at the stubborn laminate, fractures splintered further up his composure. This isn't working. It's not working. Panic clawed at his throat, dousing rational thought in adrenaline. With a frustrated snarl, he swiped the ID off the desk, sending it skittering across the floor. Rick snatched it up reflexively before it slid under the bed, out of sight, but not out of mind. Both froze at the distant thud of footsteps passing in the hall. Had their scuffle been overheard, heart pounding, Billy pressed his ear to the door, but heard only standard house noises drifting up from the TV. Taking a steadying breath, he turned back to his brother. "We need a better plan, something foolproof. There has to be a way to undo this." Rick nodded mutely, eyes red, rimmed with guilt and fear. The weeks of denial had built a dam holding back the emotions surging within, now threatening to break through the cracks. "It's all my fault. I pushed you into it, and now look," he choked, waving the damning eye. Billy sank onto the bed, mind racing. Going to the police was out of the question. Who knew how deep this criminal network ran, or if anonymous tip lines were truly anonymous? No. The only way was to destroy the evidence completely, erase their digital fingerprints, and pray the seller had no reason to look closer to home. His gaze fell on the old nail polish bottles cluttering his desk, relics of an arts and crafts phase long past. "Acetone," he said suddenly, eyes lighting up. At Rick's blank look, he grabbed a bottle and uncapped the pungent chemical. Nail polish remover. It melts the laminate and photo. We soak the ID until there's nothing left. Rick peered between white-knuckled fingers, unwilling to get any closer to the incriminating object. With a steadying breath, Billy took the ID and submerged it in the small glass bottle. They watched tensely as the liquid clouded, swirling ink and pixels into dissolving filaments. Bit by bit, the fake ID dissolved away, fingerprints and likeness bleeding into obscurity, until only an empty bottle remained. The evidence was destroyed, but what trace lingered elsewhere, online or in dark corners of computer memory banks? That question gnawed a hole in Billy's thoughts like acid, even as the physical threat dissolved before their eyes. A loud knock startled them again, both flinching as their mother's muffled voice called through the door. "Boys, dinner's ready." The mundane words fell jarringly against their frayed nerves. Exchanging panicked looks, they raced to stash the nail polish and wipe any lingering fingerprints before answering with shaking smiles. "Coming," Billy managed, swallowing the bitter chemical aftertaste coating his mouth and thoughts alike. How would he even taste normal food now with the lingering metal of fear on his tongue? In heavy silence, they sat through the family meal, half listening to their parents' idle chatter and pretending interest in sibling squabbles. Rick pushed his food around without appetite, while Billy forced down small bites, willing his churning gut to accept the nourishment. He couldn't let on that anything was amiss, not when he didn't yet know how deep the threads of danger extended. Across the table, Rick gazed hauntedly into the middle distance, eyes seeing past walls into a past walls into a past just weeks old that now loomed much larger over everything. That night, Billy lay awake long after sleepy house noises faded, tangled in his sheets like a web. His mind replayed every click, scroll, and typed word from those fateful online sessions until questions multiplied faster than answers. Who was behind that anonymous Bitcoin account? How much personal data could be gleaned from their scant digital footprint? Most disturbingly, what else might motivate someone in those dark underbellies to trace cryptic transactions back to real homes and faces? He didn't realize Rick's bed had creaked across the room until a whisper broke the thick silence. "Luke, you still up?" came the small, fearful voice. "Yeah," Billy sighed, rolling over to face his brother silhouetted against the window. Street lights filtered through slatted blinds, drawing pale blue lines across Rick's worried features. There was a long pause as both struggled to find words for the shapeless apprehension stealing into their formerly carefree youth. Finally, Rick spoke again, barely audible. "Do you think they could find us, even after we destroyed it?" The unspoken, they hung between them, faceless entities from another realm, not meant for innocent eyes. Billy didn't want to frighten his brother further, but lying would be crueler still. "I don't know," he admitted heavily. Maybe not. But we're not taking any more chances. You got me. No more weird sights. Bitcoin. Nothing. A long silence followed as Rick absorbed the gravity of their mistake. "I'm sorry, Billy. This is all my fault." Guilt clouded his usually cheerful tone. Billy sighed, some of the turmoil unfurling at his brother's remorse. "It's okay. We're in this together now. Just promise me, no more risks, online or real. Deal." After a beat, Rick nodded fervently into the shadows. "Deal." Some small measure of calm settled over both at the pact, uniting them against nameless looming threats. But as Billy drifted into fitful sleep, he couldn't shake the gnawing sense that, for better or worse, their fates were sealed from this point onward, bound equally to each other. And whatever lay in wait on the winding road ahead, within internet code or outside the safe fences of suburbia, only time would tell how far consequences of rash online exploring might yet reach into the mundane present glowing beyond the bedroom blinds. The dark web had proven disturbingly real, and reality held its own darkness just as unfathomable. Days passed tensely as Rick and Billy fell back into the rhythm of school and home, clinging to normal routines with fervent purpose. The week's homework was parsed with newfound focus, sports games attended with real enthusiasm, sibling bickering exaggerated as if to convince themselves all was truly well behind bedroom walls. But their pact to never return online brought small comfort against lingering unease. It was a Thursday noon break when Rick spotted his friend Max waving him over, baseball cap tugged low as if sharing a secret. "Hey, man, check it," he said covertly, sliding his phone across their cafeteria table. Rick's blood ran cold, seeing displayed on the cracked screen a darknet discussion forum debating recent online shenanigans. His doppelganger stared back from a grainy jeg downloaded from an anonymous tip, accompanying claims of fraudulent purchases and IP addresses, tracing back to their zip code. But no, it couldn't be. They'd destroyed all evidence meticulously, leaving no trail. Max nudged him curiously as his face drained of color. "You good, bro. Recognize that dude?" Fumbling for words, Rick grabbed the phone and jogged off, mumbling about class. Every pair of eyes in the crowded room now weighed ominously on his frayed nerves. He had to show Billy, had to know they weren't being paranoid. Their next class passed in a blur as Rick twisted anxiously in his seat, gnawing a ragged cuticle while ominous questions swirled. Upon dismissal, he pulled Billy aside, shoving the incriminating phone screen between white knuckles. "Explain this," he hissed manically. Billy paled at the post, scanning it frantically for clues. "No way, we covered our tracks completely." His voice faltered at the photo. It was undeniably Rick, unmistakable freckles peeking from pixelated shadows. "Someone tipped them. Ratted us out," Rick muttered, fists clenching. "But who? Who knew?" Billy grabbed his shoulders firmly, willing calm over panic. "Breathe. Max didn't seem to put it together. Right. Let's just get through the day and think it home with clear heads." Though his own pulse raced, years of keeping Rick level-headed in crises kicked in. No need escalating further here with so much at stake. The remainder of classes crawled by at a snail's pace, fueled by dread. When the final bell at last rang out, both bolted for the front doors like shot from a cannon, sprinting towards perceived safety of their subdivision. Not until doubled over in the driveway, gasping for breath, did they dare speak of the ominous signs again. "Now what?" Rick panted, throwing his backpack to the porch in a fit. Billy wiped sweat from his brow, considering options with the care of a chess master. We lay low, act normal, and keep an eye out. He decided at length, hoping his calm facade masked inner panic. If something's coming, best we don't make it obvious we know. His voice trailed off at a chilling thought. What if something was already closing in while they spoke, unseen in blind spots and back alleys? A dark car slowing as it passed didn't help steady frayed nerves. Inside, the house greeted them with stifling normalcy. The lamplit living room where family dramas played out nightly. Snack wrappers strewn about homework stations, voices floating down from parents unwinding after long days. Yet now it felt like another reality, separated from Rick and Billy by an insurmountable divide. Their true world had expanded unseen to shadowy back channels and nameless parties harboring obscure motives. "Come on, let's eat," Billy prompted wearily, dragging his brother to the refuge of microwave dinners and mundane family chatter. Night fell heavily, darkness pressing in from all sides through open bedroom blinds. Billy lay awake fretting over variables beyond his control, while Rick tossed restlessly across the way, jolting at every passing siren or rustle of branches. Sometime after midnight, unnatural stillness stole over the neighborhood. Even the perpetual drone of highway traffic beyond the trees faded to ominous silence. Two sets of eyes shot wide open at once, drawn by invisible tethers to windows seeking clues in the void. A flicker of movement caught their aligned gazes. Just a shadow, separating from deeper shadows at the sidewalk, backlit by the lone street lamp. Rigid as statues, they watched transfixed as the dim shape drifted inexorably up their front walk at a sluggish, purposeful gait. Each leaden footfall crunched like bones, breaking in the ringing silence. At the mailbox, a gloved hand arced up, slicing the night with a glint of metal. The sharp crack of steel on fiberglass shattered the fragile calm as surely as their lives had been upended by fleeting clickstring decisions. A scream lodged in Billy's throat, blocked by icy talons gripping his windpipe. Across the room, he saw in his brother's face a mirror of primal terror and readiness to spring into action on instinct alone, if these walls should breach. Heartbeats stretched into cruelly drawn-out minutes as the ominous figure loomed, lingering as if savoring their dread before fading back into the nightmarish emptiness once it came. No otherworldly collision followed to end the momentous standoff, only withdrawing footfalls receding into the void once more. Were the shadows playing tricks in the leaping moonlight? An intruder marking territory or deranged coincidence leaving its own form of grim message, understood by two young minds pushed past endurance? No reassurances could stem the rising tide in that moment, leaving brothers adrift on an insular sea of dread, where childhood fears once anchored them, and logic held no sway against encroaching nightmares, invading through slitted blinds. In delving into forbidden corners of the internet, had they truly unleashed some nameless evil upon the shores of their peaceful suburb? The dire warning signs seemed authored by darker powers, spelling out their inescapable fate in a cryptography of fear understood by two shaken souls alone. Dawn broke hesitantly through cracks in the blinds. Shades of blue, melting into gray that mirrored numb minds, wrestling in endless, sleepless night. Billy and Rick had kept a mute vigil through jittery hours of imagined phantoms and questioned realities, seeking comfort in each other's fear, but finding none to allay their own. Now, as morning's meager light seeped through, clarity brought no relief, only resignation to the changed landscape of their world. In unspoken agreement, they rose stiffly to begin the trial of facing all that had transpired from a single morbid curiosity. First, the front yard where scattered remnants of the broken mailbox told a no less damning story in stark daylight. Their mother's scream shook ravens from trees at the sight of splintered ceramic littering grass. Inside, shaken accounts were stuttered out between sips of tea, a tweaked truth casting the intruder as masked prowlers rather than apparitions from the netherworld. They knew stalked real streets as much as digital avenues now. Still, their eyes conveyed a darkness parents could never comprehend. Days passed under a shroud as Billy coordinated repairs and damage control, while Rick withdrew into tormented silence. School offered no refuge from prying questions to which they had no answers, only vague denials and excuses tiring even to themselves. Still, the tendrils tightened. Strange clicks and pings notified whenever browsing history was purged. Phone signal dropped at odd intervals. Footsteps seemed to shadow their path home through leaf litter. Or was exhaustion blurring reality's frame? Impossible to say where paranoia ended and new threats began. One night, alone in his room, scrubbing the last traces of incriminating searches, something cracked in Billy. Fists crashed against resistant keys, leaving dents and scattered plastic shards as frustrations boiled over in a burst of raw anguish. He sunk, defeated among technologic remains, heaving dry sobs muffled against arms wrapped protectively around his head against unseen assailants. It was too much. The uncertainty, terror, guilt for leading his beloved brother into this hellish trap with some careless clicks. A light touch startled Billy from his unraveling, finding Rick crouched tenderly at his side. No words were needed, only their mournful embrace conveying all the torment, love and loyalty binding them against the cruelties of an uncaring world. Later, as exhaustion claimed fitful sleep, Rick's hand sought solace in his brother's strong grip like lost boys, adrift too far from safe harbor. In each other, they found surviving fragments of innocence, despoiled too soon. Morning saw red-rimmed eyes surveying a changed horizon. Their fate was sealed. No returning to naive youth with this anchor of fear dropped around young necks, only moving forward, wiser and weathered far beyond years. Over rounds of toast and black coffee, a grim pact solidified. Leave this stifling town where dark memories lurked behind every neighborly smile. Find purpose and healing through dedicated study, far from grasping claws of the past. The wide open road beckoned two souls, ready to outrun ghosts with the relentless march of time. Years flew by in a bittersweet blur as scholarships and late nights forged the frightened boys into focused young men. Newsletters home painted a rosy facade while private discussions voiced worries for loved ones left to carry on in that haunted place. But visits home grew briefer, excuses flimsier as distance cast the past in kinder light while new adventures called. On graduation eve, brothers stood framed against a vivid orange sunset, much like the dawn, giving hope in their darkest hour-long past. Hand in hand, they watched the blazing orb sink beneath distant tree lines, perhaps for the last time. So much had changed, yet the immutable bonds of family, friendship, and shared trials alone remained steadfast. Billy turned to his brother with a rueful smile. Look how far we've come. Rick nodded, tracing constellations in fading colors as he had childhood dreams in simpler evenings. Sure, learned our lesson. That's for damn sure. Reckon those shades are still lurking out there somewhere. He mused. More contemplative than fearful now, Billy squeezed his hand, following his gaze beyond visible limits. Maybe, maybe not. But we're rid of them for good. You and me, wherever the road takes us from here, long as we stick together. With that, they turned from the burning skyline towards dreams still untamed and futures glowing on fresh horizons. The jagged scars of formative trials faded to lessons carried forward, while new adventures called two souls marching in step towards the light, changed but unbroken after surviving consequences. No amount of care could have foretold or protected innocent hearts from learning. Such was the bittersweet alchemy wrought of confronting darkness within and finding solace in each other's guiding sun. It was just meant as a joke. That's what Mark kept telling himself as he stood frozen in the apartment's entryway, staring at the stranger, sitting bound and gagged on his living room floor. She stared back with wide, frightened eyes, and in them, he saw his careless actions reflected back at him in stark horror. His pulse raced as Mike bustled about the cramped space, frantically tidying as if that could undo what had been set in motion. Relax, man. It was a prank that went too far. No big deal, Mike said with nervous bravado. But they both knew the depths they'd strayed into on the dark web were very real, and this woman was no joke. The auction had started like any other strange find on the deep recesses of the internet. More curiosity than intent. But then Mike nudged him. Dude, place a bid. I dare you. And with one rash tap of his finger, Mark had committed them, winning her for the bitcoins in his virtual wallet. In seconds, their lives had veered onto a path they never could have imagined. Now, she lay bound on the dirty carpet at his feet, stripped of dignity and choice. Mark's stomach turned at the bleakness in her stare, the resignation that she had become an object to do with as they pleased. His hand trembled as he ran it through his hair, wanting desperately to undo the last hour, but knowing it was far too late for that. We have to call the police, he said at last, finding his voice. Mike froze. Are you crazy? Do you have any idea what kind of trouble we'd be in? Mark rounded on him. Then what do you suggest? Keeping her as a pet? This isn't some game, Mike. She's a person. His friend's eyes were wild with escalating panic. Just calm down. Okay, if we think this through. 3 sharp knocks exploded against the apartment's front door, cutting through the rising tensions like a knife. In that moment, 2 truths became painfully clear. There would be no thinking their way out of this, and they were no longer alone with their terrible secret. The knocks seemed to echo endlessly in the ensuing silence. Mike glanced around frantically as if searching for an escape, while Mark stood frozen, numbly waiting for the inevitable. Eventually, he found the strength to move his feet, crossing the small space with leaden steps. He drew a shaky breath and unlocked the deadbolt, pulling open the door to find 2 uniformed police officers staring back with grim expectation. We received a report of a disturbance, the older officer said gruffly. His sharp eyes took in the cramped room beyond and lingered on the bound figure on the floor. Mind if we come in? Mark could only nod mutely and step aside to let them pass. He saw Mike standing white, knuckled by the kitchenette, every muscle taut with panic. The younger officer knelt by the woman, gently removing her gag as his partner questioned them. Why don't you boys tell me what's going on here? It wasn't a request. Mike shot Mark a desperate look, but found no help there. With rising dread, Mark realized it fell to him to explain, and that no explanation could undo their crime or protect them from its consequences. He took a steadying breath. There was an auction. Online. We bid as a joke, not thinking. But then we won. And she was delivered. The words tasted bitter on his tongue. It was stupid and reckless. We never meant any harm. But that doesn't change what happened. The officer's face darkened. An online auction. Do you have any idea what kind of slaving operations use those sites? Mark dropped his gaze in shame. He heard the woman sobbing softly as the younger cop soothed her, cutting the binds at her wrists. A wave of revulsion crashed over him. How had he let himself be complicit in such cruelty, even for a moment? Suddenly, Mike erupted from the corner. It was an accident. We didn't know. Mark, tell them. That's enough. The older officer silenced him with an upraised hand. You boys are coming down to the station for some questions. Cooperate and you may walk away, but I guarantee there will be charges. As cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Mark could only hang his head. Their careless actions had set off a chain of consequences beyond any ability to control or undo. All that was left was to face what came next, as those around him worked to clean up the awful mess he helped create. The basement interrogation room was harshly lit and suffocatingly small. Mark sat hunched with his head in his hands, fighting back waves of panic as the minutes ticked by with no sign of the officer's return. Across the scarred metal table, Mike paced like a caged animal, his composure finally fracturing under the strain. We need to get our stories straight. They're trying to trip us up, he rounded on Mark. Why'd you have to tell them everything, you idiot? Mark stared blearily up at him. What else could I do, Mike? We fucked up, end of story. His friend slammed a fist on the table, making him jump. No, it isn't over. Do you have any idea how much trouble we're in? A bitter laugh escaped Mark's throat. Oh, believe me, I know exactly what kind of trouble. While you just wanted to laugh, I dragged an innocent person into our joke who'll never be the same. So don't tell me I don't understand. The door swung open, cutting him off mid-sentence. But it wasn't the officer. It was a grim-faced stranger in an expensive suit. Boys, he said icily, I trust we can come to an understanding about this little misunderstanding. A chill ran down Mark's spine. He knew a threat when he heard one. Mike had gone pale, finally grasping the criminal depths they'd meddled in. But before any of them could speak, shouting erupted from the hall outside. Booted feet pounded towards the door as it was flung open once more, revealing two officers with weapons drawn. Get down on the ground now, they roared at the suited man. He merely smiled and raised his hand slowly. I was just having a friendly word with these lads. No need for hostility, officers. His smooth tone did nothing to diminish the threat in his eyes as they swept over the cowering boys. More shouts echoed from down the hall as backup arrived, followed by the clatter of chains. They were hauling someone, and the sounds of a struggle grew nearer. Mark shrank further in his chair, held captive by terrifying realization. This went far deeper than he could have ever imagined. And now there seemed to be no escape from the vortex of chaos and danger his actions had unleashed. Mark sat numbly in the interrogation room for what felt like an eternity, after the mobster had been dragged away in cuffs. Outside, the chaotic sounds of arrest and struggle continued as more operatives were rounded up in the aftermath of the raid. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion and dread settled deeply into his bones. Everything had spun violently out of control within the span of a single careless evening. He buried his face in his hands, wishing he could rewind time or wake from this nightmare. The door opened behind him, but he couldn't find the will to look up as heavy footfalls entered. We got most of them, a familiar voice said grimly. Mark raised bleary eyes to the police officer from before. Thanks to you boys, we may have taken down one of the biggest trafficking rings in the state. Some small reassurance, but it did nothing to ease the guilt or sense of responsibility weighing on Mark. He glanced toward Mike, who sat staring blankly at the scarred table. Any bravado now crushed under the true scope of their actions. A defeated sigh escaped Mark's lips. The officer considered him with a calculating gaze. The DA is willing to be lenient since you cooperated. Probation, community service. But make no mistake, you're damn lucky. All you're facing is the legal fallout. Mike let out a shaky breath of relief, but Mark hardly heard him. His thoughts were elsewhere, with the faceless victims whose lives would forever bear the scars of exploiters preying on society's margins. And with one soul in particular. The woman, is she? He couldn't bring himself to finish. A beat of understanding passed between them. She'll survive. Might take years to heal from what was done. But because of you, others may be spared that pain. Sometimes facing the darkness is the only way to spread light. Mark nodded slowly, absorbing the bittersweet wisdom as his sentence was handed down. Choices had consequences, and in that small police station, consequences had transformed into redemption and justice through facing realities far greater than themselves. It was a lesson that would stay with him always. The cursor blinked mockingly on the empty resume template. Another reminder of dwindling options. 3 months out of school and no job prospects in sight. My student debt was coming due whether or not I found work. Last semester's textbooks bought me another week's reprieve, sold off reluctantly page by painful page. What started as a bored web search for odd jobs spiraled into tabbing through forums. I wished I could unsee. Post after post advertised dangerous services in sterile language, making the unthinkable sound transactional. As the hours ticked by, my desperation matched the payments mounting daily with interest. When an ad promised funds for unlocking biometric data, I froze. Then copied the Tor link without pausing to reconsider. The site appeared innocuous at first, more BuzzFeed quiz than black market. Friendly smiles beckoned from photos alongside figures I couldn't fathom. Was it really so easy? I asked myself, feeling like a naive fool even as my fingers registered on the touchpad. 1 click later, and I was entering passport details to verify identity, doubting this tunnel through the darkest corners of the net would deliver salvation. A routine call came as the loading wheel spun endlessly, dragging me back to the present. School friends celebrated graduating jobs as I made excuses, hanging up wishing the tightness in my chest would loosen its grip. By the time the page reloaded, I had a bid on my likeness. Double what I needed to pay creditors waiting to seize whatever assets remained. Euphoria battled disgust as instructions appeared, advising the anonymous payer would be in touch. Relief lasted until morning light, revealed stains on my soul. No sum could scrub clean. I told myself it was done, that repaying family who'd taken out loans on my behalf counted as atonement. But days slipped by as more ads caught my eye, proposing cures to the suffocating panic attacks haunting nights, spent envisioning default notices and garnished wages. First fingerprints, then DNA swabs. Then, no, I wouldn't dare. Couldn't imagine selling pieces of myself while clinging to some semblance of humanity. And yet the ticking seconds mocked as strongly as ever, dragging me beneath dark waters with no sign of rescue in sight. All that kept me from sliding deeper were the faint strains of a life before, when dignity seemed an inalienable right rather than luxury, beyond my shriveled means. How long, I wondered, before desperation demanded one final transaction to square the books for good, and damn the consequences of debts that could never truly repay. The warehouse was just as desolate as the instructions foretold, crumbling walls shielding whatever illegal acts transpired within from prying eyes. Trepidation warred with relief as I picked my way through debris, telling myself this ordeal would end the constant panic. All that was asked in return seemed a small sacrifice compared to lives ruined by penury. My contact await in a pool of shadows, formless as the cryptic messages coordinating their procedure. Money exchanged hands with a chill brush of skin on skin. Metal glinted dully as gloved fingers fastened restraints, and a bag slipped snugly over my head to block the act from view. Prickling dread rose as a rushing sensation took hold, dragging me under with muffled struggles. When awareness resurfaced, muffled voices arguing roused me to agony, throbbing deep in my torso. Grimaces turned curious as my groggy flailing alerted them, hurriedly concealing tools stained red. Money lay limp in my fist, unspent life purchased to pay lingering creditors, now chasing with added vengeance. Shivering violently, I was hauled to unsteady feet and guided outside to the van, idling cold in the darkness. Days passed in a haze, as stitches strained against coughing fits and trembling limbs refused support. Phantom pains had me clutching flesh, no longer my own, but little else could hold attention through the numbness seeping into cracked lips and eyes ringed hollow. News reports blurring mentioned organ trafficking on the rise. Victims left for dead in back alleys. But who would believe my claims when evidence pointed to self-mutilation in a bid for funds? Better to endure in silence than draw unwanted attention, confirming the level of my desperation. Yet unease lingered like oozing wounds, refusing to scab over, manifesting in minor alterations distorting routine. Keys vanished from hangers, only to reappear on nightstands. Footsteps echoed in empty halls. Shadows shifted where none should fall. Was paranoid hysteria the price of misdeeds hastening recovery? Or had loose ends been tied securing silence through sinister threats? Each creak tapping out a warning that exposure would end not in salvation, but retribution, had questioning every choice leading to this juncture. How foolish to think bargains in the depths of depravity's markets went unpaid. No amount of washing could scrub clean hands stained crimson, nor rinse away the realization that fleeing was futile. They had what remained and would reclaim all taken if tethers to this life were severed too soon. All that was left was endured in isolation. Praying oblivion would claim its due before vengeance collected in full. Nerves peeled raw. I spent nights piecing together clues from fragmented sleep. Faces glimpsed only in flashes took on distinct features when waking, crowding close with cruel smiles and greedy eyes still stained red from the ordeal. Reports of the kidney case escalated as more victims turned up, flesh bearing mute witness to depravity. Against all sense, I began hunting for connections, scouring sites holding answers just out of reach. Anonymous commenters mocked efforts to uncover the syndicate, jeering that salvation lay not in truth, but ignorance. Each taunt dragged me deeper into the murky underworld harboring monsters. Paranoia amplified mundane disturbances into omens. Every creak stirred visions of dark figures gliding between shadows, toying before striking the final blow. Locks were upgraded, windows secured, yet no barrier stemmed irrational dread, seeping into once. Familiar walls. Solitude afforded no refuge either, as every reflection seemed to mock failures, bringing this fate down upon my head. What shadowy watcher was subjecting me to these trials, I wondered, and how long until madness or demise provided release? Messengers arrived bearing cryptic warnings against digging too deep, fingers brushing skin with icy intent. Threats escalated to promises of visiting greater torments upon all I held dear if pursuit continued, kindling fresh waves of self-loathing. Still, the compulsion to expose wrongs done pulled stronger than survival instincts screaming retreat. Each trail ended more violently than the last, leaving a lingering impression that forces pulling strings wished secrets, interred along with nameless victims. When footage emerged putting me at the warehouse, what little composure clung tattered finally frayed. Escape seemed the sole recourse, though packing brought no relief. Only exchange of old fears for new unknowns. Public transport became too exposed with pursuers glimpsed stalking between travelers, herding ever closer. On sporadic stretches, traversing deserted backroads, the world shrank to a pinprick scope focused solely on fleeing. Crumbling shelters offered temporary refuge to plan the next move under cover of dark. Yet rest afforded no refuge from horrors, come to roost, replaying each misstep and pleading for redemption in vain. Cold seeped through threadbare blankets as the inevitable approached on whispers carried by pre-dawn breeze. They had found me once more and would not be evaded again. Perhaps. I thought, brushing away tears freezing on skin. Escape was never more than a lie to still the soul's aching for an end to this torment. The package waited untouched for days, finality emanating in waves to match the toll extraction had taken. With trembling hands, I slid cracking seals, finding not demands, but gruesome memento. The beating heart delivered as a chilling reminder payment came due whether forfeit was freely given or reaped through force. Raw sobs racked my frame as horror gave way to grief so profound it bypassed physical torment. What innocence remained since that fateful night underground had fled, ceding to anguish no amount of tears could slake. Shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, pressing close with cold comforts of oblivion, if only surrender could be willed. In darkness, suffocating embrace, the future stretched black and barren before crumbling into an endless void. All roads led only to ruin. To flee was inviting fresh atrocities upon any souls foolish enough to extend pity. To stay ensured becoming a plaything until broken beyond repair or use. Neither living nor dying held appeal when existence had been reduced to enduring trials, conjured by depraved imaginations, seeing how deeply a person could bleed before spilling their last. Morning light revealed only greater desolation, as the pathetic remains of a life once full now seemed but shells, housing a ghost wandering bereft of purpose. Outside, the world hummed oblivious to surreal torments endured behind closed doors. Would anybody pause to question why smiles appeared painted, on when exchanging pleasantries, or notice shadows lengthening prematurely under eyes that had witnessed too much? No one could be permitted glimpsing such naked agony, lest compassion drive prying where dangers lurked. Days blended into an endless gray slog, wandering roads leading nowhere but further from peace. Static drowned rational thought, narrowing focus to autopilot routines, keeping body functioning despite a soul shattered beyond repair. Only nightmares offered escape through temporary dissolution into nothingness. But each waking ripped open freshly, scabbed wounds with fresh screams echoing silence where hopes once thrived. A message arrived eventually, typed clinical as ever in a script bearing no inflection. It was over. Remnants of the transaction were being laid to rest, and any further interference would end in unbridled carnage. Freedom, it seemed, came with the ultimate cage, that of eternal watchfulness, with violation ever looming on any misstep, straying from obscurity. All that remained was surviving, though living was but a ghostly echo of a life destroyed by one desperate mistake. Still, the shadows stretched, bidding their time until reclaiming what was stolen.